train screeched into Clearwater Depot with a scream of steel and a hiss of steam. A black iron beast, dragging its carriages across the endless plains, and with it came a story the whole town would never forget. People gathered at the platform like they always did, eager for mail, goods, or gossip. But for Clara Whitfield, the train carried her future, and her heart raced as she stepped down clutching a battered trunk and the hope of a new life. She had left behind everything back east. Her family, her name, her shame, trading it all for the promise of a husband she had never met but who had written letters full of charm, kindness, and a vision of love in the raw land of the West. She scanned the crowd until her eyes locked on him, Edward Harlan, a man with a fine suit for a rancher and a cold smile that did not match the tender words she had read by candlelight. He looked her over once, twice, then let out a laugh sharp enough to slice her in two. You're not what I ordered," he said loudly, drawing eyes and smirks from the crowd. "Too skinny, too plain, not worth the fare it took to bring you here." Clara's cheeks burned, and she tried to remind him of the promises, the letters, the vows inked in his own hand, but he waved her away like an unwanted stray dog. "I won't have you. Send yourself back east if you can." With that, he turned on his heel, leaving her humiliated before the entire depot, her dreams scattered like ashes on the wind. The whispers began instantly, cutting deeper than knives. But Clara swallowed her tears, bent to lift her heavy trunk, and prayed her trembling arms would be strong enough to carry her away from their cruel eyes. The trunk didn't budge. Despair swelled in her chest. And just as she thought she might collapse where she stood, a shadow fell across her tall and unyielding. Calloused hands, steady and strong, lifted her trunk with ease, and Clara looked up into the face of a cowboy she had not noticed before. His hat shaded storm-colored eyes, his boots were caked in dust, and his jaw carried the hard lines of a man who worked with his back and spoke little. He turned to the gawking crowd, his voice deep and even. "This here's my wife," he said, and silence swept the platform. "Any man got a problem with that can take it up with me." Whispers died, eyes fell away, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. For with one simple act and one steady sentence, this stranger had changed everything. James Carter, known simply as Carter to most of Clearwater, had never been a man to draw attention. But the moment he picked up Clara's trunk and claimed her as his wife, he knew there would be talk for weeks to come. Clara walked beside him in stunned silence, her bonnet tilted low to hide the confusion and tears that brimmed in her eyes, while he carried her trunk as though it weighed nothing, leading her away from the crowd's stares and toward his horse tethered near the depot. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered finally, her voice trembling with equal parts gratitude and disbelief. Carter glanced at her, his eyes unreadable. "Reckon I did," he answered. "Couldn't leave you standing there with every vulture in town circling." Clara's lips trembled, and she hugged herself, still hearing Edward's cruel words echoing in her mind. When they reached his horse, Carter set her trunk down, tied it securely, then offered his hand to help her into the saddle. "Name's Carter," he said simply. "Got a place a few miles out." "Ain't much, but it's decent. You'll be safe there till you figure what you want." Clara hesitated, her upbringing warring with the desperate relief she felt, then took his hand and let him lift her onto the horse. The ride out of town was quiet except for the wind through the grass and the steady rhythm of hooves. But inside Clara's heart a storm raged. She had come west to marry a stranger, and though that plan had shattered, now she found herself bound to another stranger, one who had defended her dignity with a single sentence. When they reached Carter's ranch, a modest spread nestled between low hills and wide pasture, she found it worn but welcoming, a place built by steady hands that valued hard work over appearances. Carter carried her trunk inside and nodded toward a small room. "You can have this space," he said, then added after a pause, "If anyone asks, you're my wife. Safer that way." Clara nodded slowly, realizing he wasn't asking for anything in return, just offering shelter. And though her heart was heavy with rejection, a small flicker of gratitude began to glow. Yet even as she settled into the room that night, she couldn't help but wonder, why had he chosen to step in? What kind of man was James Carter really? Life on Carter's ranch moved with the rhythm of the land, the sun dictating work and the moon guiding rest. And though Clara felt like an intruder at first, the days soon fell into a pattern that steadied her heart. She helped with the cooking, the mending, and even learned to milk the cows, surprising herself with her own strength. Carter worked long hours, his broad back bent to the labor of fencing, herding and tending the soil. But every evening he returned to share a quiet meal, his words few but his presence steady. The townsfolk, however, were not so quiet. Whispers traveled quickly in Clearwater, and every time Clara accompanied Carter into town for supplies, she felt the weight of their stares, heard the mutters about the mail-order bride, who had been rejected, and the cowboy, who had claimed her without warning. Edward Harlan, bitter that Carter had made him look a fool, spread rumors that Clara was damaged goods, unworthy of any man. But Carter silenced most of the talk simply by being who he was, a man whose word carried weight, whose fists were feared, and whose loyalty to those he cared for was ironclad. One evening, after a particularly long day, Clara found herself sitting beside Carter on the porch, the prairie stretching out before them painted gold by the setting sun. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, her hands twisting in her lap. "You didn't owe me anything. Why call me your wife?" Carter leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because no decent man lets another get tossed aside like trash in front of a crowd," he said finally. "And because I reckon I've been alone long enough." His words settled between them like an unspoken promise, and Clara felt her heart stir in ways she had thought broken beyond repair. As weeks turned into months, what had begun as an act of mercy slowly grew into something deeper, something stronger than either had expected. Clara found laughter in the little things again, and Carter, who had always carried his burdens in silence, began to open up in small but meaningful ways, sharing stories of his childhood, his parents, and the lonely years on the ranch. The town, once buzzing with gossip, grew used to seeing them together, and even Edward Harlan eventually realized his cruelty had only driven Clara into something truer and more powerful than he could ever offer. One autumn evening, with the harvest gathered and the stars blazing overhead, Carter finally spoke the words that had been building for months. "Clara," he said, his voice low but sure, "the day I picked up your trunk, I didn't know what would come of it. But I know now. I don't just want to pretend anymore. I want you as my wife, truly, if you'll have me." Clara's breath caught, tears shining in her eyes, and she whispered the only word her heart could form: "Yes." From that moment on, what began as chance became destiny, and their lives wove together like threads in a tapestry no one could tear apart. The girl who had been humiliated and cast aside became a woman cherished and chosen, and the cowboy who thought himself destined for loneliness found a partner, as steady as the land he worked. And so, dear listeners, if you've traveled this far with Clara and Carter's story, don't forget, every tale of love, redemption, and courage is worth sharing, and your support helps keep these Wild West stories alive. So hit that subscribe button, saddle up for the next ride, and stay with us as we bring you more powerful tales from the frontier, where every whisper of the wind carries a story waiting to be told.